The final echoes of war in Germany were a symphony of destruction: shattered towns, toppled steeples, blackened factories, and streets littered with rubble. For the women captured in the collapse of the Reich, these ruins were no longer just the backdrop of defeat. They were a mirror of their own exhaustion, fear, and disillusionment. Their uniforms, once symbols of power and service to an ideology, were now ragged and torn. Boots cracked, hair matted with weeks of retreat, faces smeared with soot and fatigue. Some were barely 20, girls in the shells of adult bodies, their youth buried beneath the heavy weight of war's demands. They had been secretaries, radio operators, typists, nurses, small cogs in a vast machine that had chewed up their country and left them trembling in its wake. Now, with the Reich crumbled, they were not returning home. They were being herded into trains bound for captivity, their future uncertain, their minds crowded with warnings of the horrors to come. The rails rattled beneath battered wooden boxcars as the women shuffled forward, dragging suitcases that had once carried dreams of normal life. Some clutched rosaries, some rationed tins, some nothing at all. A girl from Hamburg whispered a dread she had heard repeated in the chaos of surrender: "The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples." Another, hardened by years of manning anti-aircraft searchlights, said nothing, jaw tight, bracing against the invisible blow of anticipated cruelty. The stories they had been told, the tales of brutality, humiliation, and degradation hung over them like shadows that moved with the clatter of the train. Outside, the landscape rolled past in ghostly fragments: towns without roofs, skeletal factories, bridges collapsed into rivers, children waving from the sides of the tracks, faces thin as paper, eyes wide with the same mixture of fear and wonder. Nights were colder, longer, marked by the distant crack of gunfire and the echo of boots on the train's wooden floors. Huddled together for warmth, they whispered to each other, sharing fragments of rumor and fear, as if the sound of another human voice could stave off the imagined horrors. Anna, a secretary from Munich, scribbled her thoughts into a small diary she had managed to keep hidden. "We are being taken far. None knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be." Every mile westward felt like a descent into the unknown, through a continent scarred by hatred, destruction, and propaganda. When at last the trains delivered them to ports under the American flag, Bremen, Cherbourg, New Orleans, the women were herded forward under watchful eyes. They had imagined snarling, insults, maybe even fists, but instead, there was order, paperwork, lines moving with mechanical precision. For the first time since capture, confusion and dread replaced fear of cruelty. The ships that waited were massive, engines growling, metal decks stretching endlessly, and the coastline of Europe shrank behind them, leaving only uncertainty and the Atlantic's vast, endless expanse ahead. On board, seasickness struck many, and the air was thick with the smell of salt, diesel, and the faint aroma of industrial metal. The bunks were stacked in steel holds, and food was issued with an efficiency that seemed unreal: pale bread, thick slabs of meat, steaming mugs of coffee. The women stared in disbelief. For years, their meals had been scraps, cabbage stalks, bread mixed with sawdust, watery soup ladled from rusted cans. Now, as they tore at the bread, tears rolled down faces as disbelief mingled with gratitude. "They feed us like they feed themselves," whispered one, astonished. For the women, the contrast was so extreme and settled them more than cruelty could. There was no vengeance, no punishment, only the eerie, almost threatening civility of a world that should have been their enemies, but was not. As the ships carried them closer to American shores, their minds swirled with questions and fears. Would this land of myth and enemy caricature deliver punishment, or was something else at play? They had expected chaos, violence, and derision, but what confronted them instead was calm, routine, and meticulous care. The thought that survival could exist alongside decency was more disorienting than any battlefield, more shattering than any bombed street. And yet, the dread did not vanish. The women could not shake the feeling that behind every orderly line, every clipboard, every quiet guard, something awaited them, something they had been taught to fear above all: the unknown. Arrival in America was not a clash of guns or bombs, but a collision of expectations and reality. As they stepped onto the gangways, the sun glinting off metal rails and wooden planks, the air smelled different, clean, sharp, and impossibly alive. For the first time in years they breathed freely, though their minds remained crowded with the shadows of the Reich. Crowds lined the piers, some jeering, some merely observing. The women stiffened, expecting the worst. Yet nothing came. Only procedure, order, and the distant sound of engines and gulls. They were counted, tagged, and directed inland, traveling over roads lined with towns untouched by bombs, where children played in sunlit streets, bicycles gliding over smooth pavement, houses gleaming with white porches. The world they had been told was enemy, cruel, and untouchable, was here, intact, abundant, thriving. The women whispered to each other, trying to reconcile the disparity, trying to understand if this reality was a trick, a mirage, or something more profound. By the time they reached the camps scattered across the United States, Fort Oglethorpe, Camp Rustin, and others, they were exhausted, wary, and disoriented. Guard towers rose at intervals, soldiers patrolled casually, and the barracks stretched neatly across fields of green. The wooden buildings were painted, the paths swept, fences intact but not menacing. This was not the brutality of a concentration camp, nor the collapse of a conquered nation. This was something new, strange, and terrifyingly unfamiliar. And then, for the first time in weeks, they were led into a building that made hearts pound, the delousing station. Inside, the hissing of steam and the drip of water seemed like prelude to humiliation, degradation, punishment, the things they had been warned about. Whispers circled, eyes clutched suitcases and rosaries like shields. Each woman stepped forward, bracing for the worst. And then came the soap. Real soap. Thick white, scented faintly with flowers, heavy in the hand. Towels followed, then clean garments. Streams of hot water washed away months of grime. And with each drop, disbelief, confusion, and a dawning sense of something unfamiliar, a humanity not delivered by their own country, flooded the women's senses. Some wept openly, the sound echoing in the tiled room. Others laughed, unable to believe it. Anna wrote in her diary, trembling across the page, "We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be?" The act, simple and ordinary to Americans, became an extraordinary rupture in the world the women had known. For the first time, they felt clean, alive, and safe in a way that war had never permitted. And yet, the feeling brought not relief but unease. They had come expecting cruelty. Instead, they were confronted with something far more unsettling: decency. Soap, warmth, and dignity became weapons of a different kind, ones that chipped away at fear, suspicion, and the mental armor built to survive a cruel world. The women huddled in bunks that night, hair damp and skin shining, listening to the hum of crickets far from the echo of gunfire. They whispered, tentative, to one another. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps the world was larger, stranger, more complex than propaganda had allowed them to imagine. And as they lay awake, hearts pounding with confusion, the first cracks in the walls of loyalty, hatred, and fear began to appear. Asterisk, asterisk. Morning arrived at the camp with a soft light that seemed almost obscene to the German women. After months of darkness, soot, and fear, the sun reflected off the painted barracks and swept across the neatly raked paths, a silent reminder that the world here obeyed rules entirely foreign to them. The bell rang, a clear, mechanical sound, and the women rose from their bunks, stretching muscles stiff from sleep but startled by the absence of terror. Breakfast followed the rhythm of precision. Trays of pale bread, steaming coffee, and eggs that seemed absurdly rich. Hands hovered over the food, hesitant, as if touching it might break the spell. And some women did not eat at all, staring instead at the neat rows of trays, the calm faces of the soldiers supervising the line. They had been conditioned to expect chaos, insult, even violence. Instead, there was order, routine, and an invisible kindness that unsettled them more than any threat ever could. Anna, diary tucked safely beneath her arm, hesitated at the edge of the line. She observed the other women, some scooping portions with trembling hands, some whispering to each other, sharing disbelief like contraband. A girl from Bremen murmured to her friend, "It is too much. It cannot last." Others shook their heads, convinced that poison or trickery must be hidden within the abundant food. Yet each meal passed without incident. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to eat, tasting nourishment that had been denied for years. Each bite was a shock, each sip of coffee a reminder that they had been taught to fear the enemy. Yet here the enemy offered sustenance without condition. Work followed breakfast, assigned in shifts that rotated the women through kitchens, laundry, and fields. Tasks were mundane yet unfamiliar, their hands unaccustomed to repetitive labor in a world where every action had once been tied to war. In the laundry, Anna scrubbed American uniforms, garments worn by men who had once been sworn enemies. The scent of starch and clean fabric clung to her fingers, and the weight of the task pressed on her chest, not as punishment, but as an odd, disorienting act of survival. She folded shirts, noticing the initials stitched into the pockets, and wondered about the lives of the men who wore them, alive and well, untouched by the devastation she had known. In the fields, others harvested crops, the sun warm on their backs, the soil crumbly and soft beneath their fingernails. The labor was exhausting, but it bore a strange satisfaction, a rhythm and purpose not tied to destruction. Laughter even began to emerge in quiet bursts, soft, nervous, tentative, shocking in its existence, but slowly growing in frequency. For the women, the absurdity of their survival was compounded by the normalcy surrounding them. American towns were untouched by bombs, streets lined with thriving shops, children running freely, bicycles glinting in the sun. Cinemas played films without interruption, radios blared music, baseball scores, and announcements of local events. It was a world untouched by the horrors that had devoured their homeland. And yet, for all its abundance, it was the smallest gestures that unsettled them most. A soldier offering a crooked smile as he passed, a guard nodding respectfully, the quiet patience of civilians. They were kindnesses delivered without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude. They undermined the narrative of cruelty that had governed their lives for years. Evenings brought another kind of disorientation. The women gathered in the barracks, exhausted yet unable to sleep, their minds replaying the day's contradictions. Letters from home arrived sporadically, some filled with despair. Tales of family members scraping for survival amid rubble, children cold and hungry. The women read them aloud by candlelight, folding the paper with trembling fingers, hearts heavy with guilt for the abundance they could not share. "We live in the cellar now. The house above destroyed. We boil weeds for soup," one read aloud, the voice breaking as silence followed. The gulf between the ruined streets of Germany and the thriving towns they had glimpsed during work details widened daily. Some women whispered that they were living in a dream, that the abundance and civility were traps, illusions designed to punish them in ways more subtle than hunger or beatings. They hoarded bread, refused to eat chocolate, inspected soap with suspicion. And yet, day after day, the routine persisted. Meals, work, showers, sleep. Nothing happened except the quiet, relentless normality of the camp, and slowly, suspicion yielded to reluctant acceptance. They were alive. They were fed. They were clothed. They were clean. The psychological weight of this transformation pressed down more heavily than chains ever had. The women had been prepared for cruelty. Decency was a weapon they could neither anticipate nor counter. Anna recorded her thoughts in the diary, the words trembling but precise. Hatred is easy. Dignity is unbearable. She was not alone in this realization. Each woman faced the same internal conflict. To accept care from the enemy was to acknowledge their humanity, to recognize a world that had existed outside propaganda and fear, to admit that her own nation had failed her. The soap, the showers, the food, they were symbols of something far larger than personal survival. They demanded reflection, introspection, and confrontation with beliefs so long held that questioning them felt like betrayal. Every day, the women's bodies adjusted. Hair regained its luster, cheeks filled out, skin cleared, and they began to look more like the girls they had been before the war, not the exhausted, shadowed figures molded by months of starvation and terror. Some wept quietly as they observed these changes, mourning the years lost, the suffering endured, and the cruel lies fed to them. Others laughed nervously, unsure whether it was joy, relief, or guilt they felt. The guards noticed too. Soldiers who had once seen only enemy uniform now saw young women who blinked in disbelief at normalcy, who smiled at a kind gesture or hesitated before tasting food, and the soldiers were disarmed in turn. One wrote in a letter, "They are not monsters, not what we were told. They are girls waiting for a blow that never comes." In this quiet observation, a mutual human recognition began to form, fragile, incomplete, and riddled with contradiction. Small interactions became profound lessons in disorientation. One evening, a soldier dropped his flashlight during roll call. Anna bent instinctively to return it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. Eyes met, a nod passed silently between them, and the moment lingered in the mind far longer than any order given. A girl from Cologne hummed along to a tune a passing soldier sang, laughter spilling into the air in violation of all expectation. These seemingly insignificant exchanges shattered the narrative of enmity piece by piece, leaving the women bewildered and unable to reconcile what they had imagined with what existed before them. Meanwhile, rumors persisted among the captives. Some believed the abundance was a facade. Some feared punishment was imminent. Some clung to starvation, distrust, and anger as shields against reality. Yet no blow fell, no cruelty arrived. The routine of life in captivity continued with meticulous consistency. And in that relentless normality, the prisoner's greatest challenge emerged: not survival, not fear, but the mental unraveling brought on by unexpected decency. The enemy had been taught to be beasts, and now, through meals, showers, work, and small human gestures, the enemy demonstrated that such a belief was false. In quiet moments, Anna wrote in the diary, "We eat, we sleep, we live." And each act of kindness cuts deeper than any blow ever could. Asterisk days blurred into weeks as the rhythm of camp life settled in, but the disorientation never fully eased. The German women had entered captivity bracing for cruelty, but the relentless normality of the American camps was a strange, almost unbearable assault on the mind. Each sunrise brought the same routine: the bell, the line for breakfast, assignments for work in kitchens, laundry, and fields, the small but growing pleasures of abundance, and the quiet, understated decency of those around them. Yet beneath this monotony, the women wrestled with a storm that had no name. Their minds were crowded with contradictions, memories of starvation and destruction, the expectation of brutality, and the shocking reality of warmth, soap, and sustenance. Anna's diary reflected the tumult. She wrote, "I eat and my stomach thanks me. I sleep and my body grows strong. Yet each kindness cuts me deeper. Hatred is easier. Dignity is unbearable." The truth was evident, and yet impossible to fully grasp. Every clean uniform, every hot meal, every bar of chocolate, and every ordinary gesture of a soldier chipped away at the fortress of propaganda and fear that had protected them for years. In the laundry, Anna worked methodically, folding shirts worn by men she had been taught to despise. The initials stitched into the pockets were a reminder that each garment belonged to a person, and each person existed in a reality far removed from the devastation they had left behind. The act of washing uniforms became a quiet meditation, a confrontation with the contradictions of war and survival. In the fields, women bent under the sun, hands raw from toil but bodies nourished, muscles aching in a new way, one tied to growth rather than exhaustion or fear. Even labor became disorienting. It was a task with purpose, yet no cruelty shadowed it, no punishment, no humiliation. The very ordinariness of life, the predictability of meals and work, became a kind of psychological battleground, a challenge to every belief and expectation they had carried from Germany. The canteen became a symbol of this quiet revolution. With the small wages earned through work, camp script in hand, the women encountered objects of desire they had never dared imagine. Chocolate, cigarettes, jars of jam, even tubes of lipstick. These were trivialities by any measure, but to women who had known starvation and soot, they were miracles. The first time Anna bit into a chocolate bar, the sweetness exploded on her tongue, overwhelming her senses. Tears pricked her eyes, and she turned away, ashamed at the vulnerability of joy. Others lingered over mirrors, tentative smiles smeared with lipstick, struggling to recognize themselves as human once again. A girl whispered, "I feel human again," and the words, soft and trembling, carried a weight heavier than the bombs they had fled. The disparity between this life and the ruin of Germany was unbearable. Letters from home arrived sporadically, telling of collapsed buildings, children scavenging rubble for scraps, families boiling weeds for soup. The juxtaposition between these desperate lives and the thriving world of the camp weighed on the women with a guilt that neither physical restraint nor chains could match. Rumors, whispers, and skepticism persisted. Some women refused to eat, some hoarded bread, convinced that this generosity was a trap, that the abundance and civility could not be real. And yet, the weeks passed, each day identical to the last in its rhythm and order, and slowly, suspicion gave way to reluctant trust. The women grew healthier, bodies adjusting to consistent nourishment, skin clearing, hair regaining its luster. Some even looked younger, as if the years of starvation and terror had been peeled away, leaving the girls they had been before the war. Every mirror, every reflection, was a revelation and a challenge. The enemy, the Americans they had feared and imagined as monsters, was human, and in demonstrating humanity, they undermined every belief the women had been raised to hold sacred. Encounters with the guards deepened the internal conflict. Some were friendly, offering quiet smiles, nods, or cigarettes passed across the wire. Others were indifferent, professional, maintaining order without cruelty. A few showed glimpses of disdain, a shadow of loss in their eyes for brothers fallen overseas. Yet these feelings rarely spilled into action. The women, once trained to expect brutality, found themselves suspended between relief and unease, their minds scrambling to categorize experiences for which no precedent existed. Simple gestures, a shared laugh over a song, the return of a dropped flashlight, the acknowledgement of their humanity were more destabilizing than years of propaganda could have imagined. For the women, every interaction, every meal, every shower, every ordinary day was a confrontation with their assumptions, a test of perception, and an emotional battlefield. Outings to nearby towns were even more disorienting. Trucks carried them past streets bustling with life, unscarred by bombs, lined with shops overflowing with goods, children playing freely, adults moving about without fear. The sights, sounds, and smells assaulted their senses, bakeries releasing the aroma of fresh bread, radios broadcasting music and news, the gleam of polished cars. the colors and vibrancy of a world untouched by war. The women whispered in disbelief, comparing the thriving streets of America to the rubble they had left behind. It was intoxicating and terrifying at once. Some laughed, some cried, some fell silent, overwhelmed by the contrast. Anna observed it all, scribbling in her diary, recording the dissonance between what they had been taught to expect and what they actually witnessed. The world was larger, stranger, and more humane than propaganda had allowed them to imagine. And the weight of this realization pressed on them more heavily than any fear or hunger ever could. Evenings in the barracks were quiet, yet electric with unspoken reflection. Women shared letters from home, voices soft as they read tales of desperation and survival. They discussed what they had seen, what they had eaten, and the stark contrast with the chaos of Germany. Conversations circled around guilt and wonder, loyalty and disbelief. Some admitted the unthinkable, that their nation had failed them, that perhaps the Americans, those they had been taught to hate, were more humane than anyone they had ever known. Silence often carried more weight than words, and the unspoken questions about morality, survival, and identity hung over them like a heavy, invisible mist. Anna wrote, "To be brutalized would have been easier. To be dignified by the enemy is unbearable." The sentiment resonated across the barracks, shared quietly in glances, nods, and whispered affirmations. Survival, they realized, was no longer only about food, shelter, and work. It was about confronting truths that demanded reconciliation, about understanding that the enemy could challenge the deepest convictions they had held about loyalty, humanity, and justice. As weeks turned into months, the German women began to feel the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their perception of the world. Life in the American camps was orderly, abundant, and safe, a reality so unfamiliar it pressed on their minds like an unrelenting tide. The routine was deceptively simple: meals, work, showers, sleep, letters, and small excursions into nearby towns. Yet beneath this apparent normalcy, a storm of internal conflict raged. The women had been trained to expect cruelty, punishment, and derision. But what confronted them was something far stranger: civility. Every act of kindness, every measured smile from a soldier, every hot shower, every portion of real bread was a challenge to the mental armor they had relied upon to survive the Reich's collapse. Anna's diary captured the essence of this disorientation. They feed us. They wash us. They speak to us without anger. And each gesture is more terrifying than a blow. The realization was simple, yet profound. The enemy's humanity could unravel a lifetime of propaganda faster than any weapon of war. Life in the barracks oscillated between comfort and suspicion. Some women embraced the routines, finding reassurance in the predictability of clean clothes, steady meals, and the warmth of heated bunks. Others resisted, hoarding bread, refusing chocolate, avoiding mirrors, convinced that the abundance and civility were a trap, an illusion designed to punish them in ways subtler than hunger or physical abuse. Every day, the conflict intensified, as small interactions with the Americans' gestures intended to assist, teach, or guide undermined long-held beliefs about loyalty, hatred, and enemy behavior. A young guard, scarcely older than the women themselves, offered a crooked smile or handed over a cigarette without commentary, shattering assumptions of cruelty. Another soldier hummed a simple tune while passing the laundry, and a girl from Cologne instinctively joined in, their voices bridging a gap built over years of indoctrination and fear. These moments, seemingly insignificant, were seismic shifts in the women's understanding of humanity, morality, and the nature of the enemy. Outings to nearby towns magnified their disorientation. Trucks carried them along streets that were unscarred by bombs, lined with thriving shops and bustling markets, children running freely in sunlight, and adults engaged in ordinary tasks without fear or suspicion. Bakeries released the aroma of fresh bread, cinemas blared the latest films, and radios broadcasted music, baseball scores, and local news. Every sight, sound, and smell contradicted the image of the enemy they had carried since childhood. The women whispered in disbelief, comparing the thriving, unbroken streets to the ruinous landscapes of their homes. Some cried, some laughed, some stood in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile reality with the nightmare they had left behind. Anna observed quietly, recording her thoughts in her diary, the words trembling with both awe and unease. Everything I believed, everything I was taught, is being questioned by the simplest acts of daily life. The world outside Germany is alive, abundant, and terrifying in its normalcy. Evenings brought introspection and unspoken reflection. Letters from home arrived sporadically, detailing bombed-out apartments, families scraping for survival, children scavenging for food. The disparity between the desperate realities of Germany and the thriving American world was overwhelming. Women gathered in small groups, reading aloud by candlelight, voices breaking as the contrast of suffering and abundance weighed heavily on them. Silence often carried more weight than words, a reminder that the mental and emotional burden of reconciliation with this strange world was immense. Conflicting feelings, guilt, shame, gratitude, and disbelief interwove in every conversation, glance, and whispered admission. They realized that survival was no longer merely about physical endurance. It had become a test of perception, morality, and identity. The slow erosion of fear and hatred continued in subtle, powerful ways. Hair regained luster, cheeks filled out, skin cleared, and bodies responded to nourishment, work, and rest. The women began to resemble the girls they had once been before war, and starvation had robbed them of their youth. Mirrors became instruments of revelation and discomfort, reflecting transformations that were impossible to ignore. Anna recorded, "We are fed, we are clean, we laugh, we are human again." And yet, the truth of our old world, the propaganda, the hunger, the lies haunts each of us like a shadow we cannot chase away. Guards, too, recognized the subtle shift. Soldiers who had once seen only enemy uniforms now saw individuals, young women struggling to reconcile indoctrination with reality. One wrote, "They are not monsters. They are girls waiting for a blow that never comes." The complexity of human behavior became increasingly impossible to navigate. Small gestures of friendship, passing smiles, shared work, and the occasional nod across a room blurred the lines between captor and captive, enemy and human. The women were caught in a tension that neither history nor training could fully prepare them for. To be treated with dignity by those they had been taught to hate was to confront their own complicity in believing lies, to face the fragility of loyalty, and to acknowledge that their understanding of morality was incomplete. Even a simple meal, a shower, or a bar of chocolate became an ethical and psychological minefield. Each woman grappled with the truth that abundance and decency could destabilize the foundation of hatred and indoctrination more effectively than any weapon ever could in this delicate equilibrium. Bonds formed quietly among the prisoners. They shared whispers, laughter, and tears, confiding in each other the thoughts they could not speak aloud to Americans, doubts about loyalty, the guilt of abundance, and the fragile realization that the enemy's humanity might be true. Nights were filled with hushed discussions, each word carrying the weight of months of deception, indoctrination, and fear. Anna's diary became a confessional of sorts, recording the paradoxical experience of being treated with care, witnessing abundance, and surviving without cruelty. We are alive. We are fed. We are clean. And every kindness cuts deeper than any blow, she wrote, her pen trembling as if unable to contain the dissonance. The war had ended, yet within the women, a new conflict raged, one of perception, morality, and human understanding. The enemy had won not with bombs or bullets, but with soap, bread, and the quiet, persistent affirmation of dignity. Asterisk. Winter crept into the camp with frost, edging the wire fences and painting the barracks roof silver. The rhythm of daily life remained unbroken: bells, meals, work, showers, letters, but the women now carried a new, heavier awareness. The abundance they had been given was no longer a novelty. It was a test of the mind, a quiet but relentless force that demanded they reconcile everything they had been taught with everything they were now experiencing. Anna often sat on the wooden steps of the barracks, diary balanced on her knees, staring at the pale light of early morning. She traced the steam rising from the laundry chimneys, the glimmer of frost on the paths, and reflected on the inconceivable contrast between this thriving, peaceful world and the ruined streets of Germany she had left behind. Each day brought subtle revelations: a bar of chocolate, a loaf of bread, a hot shower, a kind word from a soldier. None were accompanied by expectation or threat, yet each carried a weight that challenged her understanding of loyalty, morality, and the enemy she had been taught to fear. She wrote, "To survive the Reich was easy. To survive this kindness is harder than any battle." Rumors of repatriation circulated through the barracks, sending tremors through the women. To return meant confronting the ruins of Germany, to step back into hunger, fear, and devastation. The thought of leaving warmth, abundance, and safety behind filled them with quiet dread. Some whispered that they were afraid to go home, that the streets of Germany, bombed out, empty, silent, would feel more like a cage than this camp ever had. The American guards noticed the unease, but understood only partially. The conflict within the women was invisible, internalized, more dangerous to their sense of self than any weapon. Anna's diary captured the tension. "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving. Here, I am alive, nourished, and treated with dignity. There, I will be reminded of all that has been stolen." Each day's work, each meal, each shower was a rehearsal in the strange morality of captivity: survival without cruelty, dignity without reward, abundance without expectation. Outside the wire, the world continued to exist in a way that both awed and unsettled them. Fields of crops stretched endlessly, towns bustled with ordinary life, and the air smelled sweet and untarnished by war. The women were escorted into these towns for labor harvesting, canning, cleaning, and everywhere they went, the stark contrast between German ruin and American vitality struck them. Children waved with innocent curiosity, adults regarded them with mild interest or polite acknowledgement, and life flowed without fear. Every sensory detail, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the scent of baking bread, the sound of laughter, served as a reminder that the enemy's world was not the world they had been taught to fear. It was larger, richer, and more humane than they had imagined, and the realization gnawed at the core of their indoctrination. The women's internal transformation became increasingly evident. Their bodies, nourished and rested, reflected the gradual reclaiming of youth and vitality. Hair regained its shine, cheeks filled out, eyes brightened with life previously extinguished by hunger and exhaustion. Every mirror became a confrontation with both the past and the present, the girls they had been, the women they had survived to become, and the impossibility of the enemy being monstrous in the ways they had been taught. Anna reflected, "We are human again, yet the world we believed in has crumbled. How can I reconcile the hands that feed me with those that bombed my city?" The question haunted every woman, leaving no certainty in its wake. Moments of human connection grew more potent. A guard passed a cigarette across the laundry floor. A smile exchanged briefly during roll call. The shared hum of a tune across the camp small. Fleeting gestures that carried more meaning than months of indoctrination. Each encounter chipped away at their defenses, forcing them to acknowledge that the enemy was not only human but capable of compassion, patience, and civility. Even as they began to enjoy small pleasures, chocolate, soap, warmth, laughter, they were constantly aware of the world they had lost and the moral complexity of being cared for by those they had once feared. These moments were profound, yet destabilizing, creating a tension that required constant reflection. The day of repatriation finally arrived, cold and crisp, the frost glinting off barbed wire and rooftops. The women lined up, hearts pounding, each step forward heavy with anticipation and fear. The buses carried them through roads flanked by green fields, past towns that seemed untouched by war, and toward trains that would return them to a land of rubble and despair. Anna's mind raced. The familiar, starving streets of Germany awaited, but so too did the memory of soap, bread, warmth, and the subtle kindness of strangers. Each mile stretched the conflict within them, taught gratitude and guilt, relief and dread, loyalty to a nation that had failed them, and recognition of the enemy who had preserved their lives. They had survived captivity, but the real battle now lay ahead. Reconciliation with the truths revealed by their unexpected humane treatment. As Anna stepped onto the train, she clutched her diary, her pen ready to capture the final lessons of this strange, disorienting chapter. She reflected on the enduring power of decency, the quiet resistance of routine and compassion, and the realization that survival was not merely physical, but moral and psychological. She wrote, "The Reich took everything but my obedience. America gave me life, and in it, the truth. Kindness can undo hatred, and humanity can be stronger than the strongest weapon." The train pulled away, the frost glinting on the wire, carrying the women back to a homeland of ruins, but leaving them forever altered. They were no longer merely survivors. They were witnesses to the power of dignity and abundance in the face of indoctrinated fear. And though the streets of Germany would challenge them, the lessons of soap, bread, showers, and quiet humanity would remain, a lasting testament to the enemy's unexpected strength and the enduring resilience of the human spirit.